He was a phantom of the Navy SEALs, trained to hunt in absolute silence, but now exiled because silence was the only thing his mind couldn't survive. Caleb Vance retreated to the edge of the world, a dead lighthouse where the ocean roared loud enough to drown the screaming tinnitus in his ears. He came here to let the storm finish him off. But when his crippled war dog stiffened in the dark, Caleb didn't find the solitude he craved. He found a desperate mother and a silent child washing up on his doorstep. He thought he was guarding a tomb. He didn't know he was about to become a sanctuary. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, hit subscribe so you never miss another tale of loyalty, courage, and heart. Your support truly means the world. The lighthouse stood on the jagged edge of the Maine coast like a tombstone aimed at the sky. It was a relic, decommissioned years ago, stripped of its official purpose but left to weather the Atlantic's temper. The salt air here didn't just blow, it bit. It chewed through iron and sealed rot into wood. For most, this place was desolate. For Chief Petty Officer Caleb Vance, it was the only place loud enough to let him think. At 34, Caleb moved with the tightly wound tension of a man expecting an ambush in his own living room. He was built like a breakwater, solid, unyielding, worn down by constant friction. His face was a map of sharp angles and shadow, hidden beneath a beard that hadn't seen a razor since his discharge papers were signed. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were constantly shifting, scanning, never resting on one thing for more than a second. He stood on the iron gallery of the lighthouse, leaning into a wind that threatened to tear the coat off his back. Below, the ocean smashed against the granite cliffs with the rhythmic violence of artillery fire. Boom, hiss, boom. Caleb closed his eyes and exhaled. To anyone else, the noise would be deafening. To Caleb, it was medicine. The explosion that had ended his career hadn't taken his life, but it had taken his silence. It left him with a severe case of tinnitus, a high-pitched, screaming whine that lived permanently inside his skull. In a quiet room, the sound was maddening, a siren that never stopped wailing. Silence wasn't peace. Silence was torture. He needed the roar of the ocean, the gale-force winds, the chaos of nature to drown out the noise of his own nervous system. He wasn't alone on the gallery. Gunner sat by his heel, pressing his weight against Caleb's calf. The Belgian Malinois was a veteran of the same campaigns, a creature once capable of running down insurgents in pitch blackness. Now, Gunner sat with his left hind leg extended at an awkward angle. A 3-story fall during an extraction had shattered his hip and ended his service. Gunner didn't run anymore. He limped. His muzzle was frosted with the white hairs of age and his movements were stiff, governed by the damp cold. But his ears were still sharp. Gunner was the ears Caleb could no longer trust. If the dog relaxed, Caleb relaxed. If Gunner stiffened, Caleb's hand went to the knife at his belt before he even consciously registered why. They were a matching set. The deafened soldier and the crippled dog. 2 tools left in the shed because they were too damaged to work, but too dangerous to throw away. Caleb turned and stepped back inside the lantern room. The air here was still, smelling of old brass and vinegar. In the center of the room stood the massive Fresnel lens, a beehive of glass prisms that had once cast light 20 miles out to sea. It was dark now. Dead. Yet, Caleb picked up his cloth and began to polish. He moved around the glass with obsessive precision, small circles, firm pressure. He checked for smudges, for dust, for the salty film the sea tried to deposit on the panes. He spent hours up here every day, tending to a light that would never shine again. There were no ships looking for him, no captains praying for his beam to cut through the fog, but Caleb scrubbed because dirt was chaos and cleaning was control. In a life where he couldn't fix the ringing in his ears, couldn't fix Gunner's shattered hip, and couldn't fix the memories of the men he hadn't been able to bring home, he could at least make the glass clear. It was his penance. a daily ritual performed in the circular church of the tower. He wiped away the grime, imagining that if he scrubbed hard enough he might eventually clean the stain of the war from his own soul. Gunnar whined low in his throat, a sound that vibrated against the metal floor. Caleb stopped. He looked down. The dog was staring at the heavy iron door leading downstairs, ears pricked forward, hackles rising slowly along his spine. Caleb felt the shift before he heard it. The wind outside had changed pitch, turning from a howl into a scream. The pressure in the room dropped, popping his ears. He looked at the barometer on the wall. The needle was falling faster than he had ever seen. The ocean wasn't just angry anymore, it was hungry. And it was bringing something with it. The storm arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule, and it didn't come with a warning. It came with a hammer. The first gust hit the lighthouse with enough force to make the iron gallery shudder beneath Caleb's boots. Rain didn't fall. It was driven horizontally, turning into thousands of tiny needles that scoured the glass of the lantern room. Caleb was already moving. He wasn't panicking. Panic was a luxury for people who hadn't been trained to function while the world ended around them. He was securing the storm shutters on the lower level, his movements precise and mechanical. Check the latch. Test the tension. Move to the next. Then Gunnar barked. It wasn't his usual low grumble at a shifting shadow. This was a sharp, rhythmic bark, the kind designed to cut through chaos. Caleb couldn't hear the tone, but he felt the vibration of it through the floorboards, and he saw the dog's posture. Gunnar was standing at the heavy steel door, body rigid, nose pressed to the crack where the wind howled through. Caleb stepped up beside him. He placed a hand on the dog's neck. The fur was bristling. Gunnar looked up, then back at the door, then let out a sharp whine that pierced through the ringing in Caleb's ears. Something was out there. Caleb didn't hesitate. He threw the bolt and shoved the door open. The wind caught it immediately, trying to rip the hinges from the stone, but Caleb leaned his shoulder into the steel, forcing it back just enough to slip through. The world outside had vanished. There was no sky, no sea, only a churning void of black and gray water. But then he saw it. 200 yards down the gravel track, where the road curved dangerously close to the cliff edge, a pair of headlights cut through the deluge. They were angled wrong. The beams were pointing up, slicing uselessly into the rain. A car, a sedan low to the ground, entirely unsuited for this terrain, had slid on the slick mud. The front passenger wheel was already hanging over the precipice. Caleb broke into a run. He moved low, keeping his center of gravity close to the earth, fighting the gale that tried to sweep him over the edge. The rain blinded him, plastering his clothes to his skin in seconds. When he reached the car, the metal was groaning. The chassis scraped against the rock as the vehicle teetered. Inside, he saw a woman. She was frozen, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. In the back seat, a small shape was huddled in a car seat. Caleb didn't tap on the glass. He didn't wave. He ripped the driver's side door open. The wind caught it and nearly tore it from his grip. "Out!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the surf. "Now!" The woman looked at him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of terror. She looked at the drop, then back at him. She couldn't move. Caleb reached in. He didn't have time for gentleness. He unbuckled her seatbelt and grabbed her arm. "The car is going over. Move." That broke the spell. She scrambled out, falling into the mud. "Leo!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "My son! Go to the tower." Caleb pointed toward the lighthouse beam sweeping blindly above them. "Go!" He dove into the back seat. The car shifted. It lurched forward inches. Caleb ignored gravity. He found the buckle of the car seat, jammed. He pulled his knife, a serrated blade that had cut through parachute cords and webbing in places far worse than this. One slash. The strap parted. He grabbed the boy. The child was light, terrifyingly light. Caleb pulled him to his chest, shielding the small head with his arm, and threw himself backward out of the car just as the ground beneath the front tire gave way. There was a screech of metal on stone, a sickening crunch, and then the headlights vanished. The car was gone, swallowed by the Atlantic. Caleb didn't look down. He grabbed the woman's jacket and hauled her up. "Run!" They battled the wind back to the lighthouse, a strange, desperate procession. Caleb took the rear, using his broad body to block the worst of the gale from the woman and the child. When they reached the heavy steel door, Gunner was there, barking them inside. Caleb shoved them through and threw his weight against the iron. He slammed the deadbolt home. Clang. The sound echoed through the circular stone room. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the heavy, damp silence of the tower. Water pooled on the floor, dripping from their clothes in steady streams. For a long moment, nobody moved. The woman, Elena, slumped against the cold stone wall, her chest heaving, her hair plastered to her face. She looked at the boy in Caleb's arms. Leo hadn't made a sound, not a scream, not a cry. He was staring at Caleb with eyes that were too old for a 6-year-old face. Caleb set the boy down gently. He stepped back, wiping the rain from his eyes. He stood there, water dripping from his beard, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He looked terrifying. He knew he did. He was a large man, scarred, holding a knife he hadn't yet sheathed, with a crippled war dog standing guard at his hip. He was a creature of violence, living in a tower of isolation. By all logic, Elena should have grabbed her child and backed away. She should have been looking for a weapon. She should have been terrified of the stranger who had just dragged her from the dark. But she didn't flinch. She looked at Caleb, and then she looked at the heavy steel bolt he had just slammed shut. There is a paradox to safety that few people understand until they have truly been in danger. Civilization teaches us to fear the wolf, to fear the man who looks like he knows how to kill. But when the storm comes, when the world is trying to eat you alive, you don't look for the kind man in the suit. You don't look for the soft answer. You look for the monster who is on your side. Elena looked at Caleb's hands that were rough, scarred, and steady. She looked at the way he stood between them and the door, not blocking their exit, but blocking the storm's entrance. Her primitive brain, the part that had kept her ancestors alive, whispered a truth that bypassed her fear. This man has survived hell. If we stay close to him, we might survive this too. She took a shaky breath, pulled Leo close to her wet coat, and nodded once. It wasn't a thank you. It was a surrender. "We have no power," Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse, sounding like gravel grinding together. "And the road is gone." Elena swallowed. "We have nowhere else to go." Caleb looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time. He saw the tremor in her hands, the silence of the boy, the way Gunner had already limped over to sniff the child's shoes without growling. "Upstairs," Caleb said, turning toward the spiral staircase. "The stone holds the heat better up there." He didn't offer to carry their bags. He didn't smile. He simply turned and began to climb, assuming they would follow. And they did, because in the middle of a hurricane, you follow the lighthouse keeper, not because he is gentle, but because he is the only thing standing still. The power didn't flicker. It died instantly, plunging the tower into a darkness so heavy it felt like physical weight. The hum of the electric heater vanished, replaced immediately by the screaming of the wind against the stone. In the sudden cold, Elena pulled Leo closer. She clicked the light switch. Nothing. She turned the tap at the small basin. A hollow cough of air, then silence. The electric pump was dead. "We have no water," she whispered, the panic rising in her voice like a tide. I have maybe 2 bottles in my bag. That's not enough. If the road is washed out for days." She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide in the gloom. Caleb didn't look back. He was already moving. For years, Caleb's mind had been wired for a single purpose: locate the threat, neutralize the threat, extract. But war teaches you more than just how to break things. It teaches you how to survive when the world has been stripped down to its bones. He moved to a heavy wooden chest bolted to the floor near the stairs. He threw the lid back. Inside, neatly organized in rows, sat the inheritance of a man who never trusted peace to last. MREs, meals ready to eat, candles wrapped in oilcloth, a portable filtration pump. "Light the candle," Caleb said, tossing a pack of matches to Elena. "Keep him warm." He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and a coil of paracord, then headed for the gallery door. Elena watched him go. She didn't understand. She saw a man walking out into a hurricane. She didn't know he was walking into his element. Outside, the wind tried to tear the canvas from his grip. Caleb ignored it. He moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 nights spent in mountains where the air was too thin to breathe. He lashed the tarp to the railing, creating a funnel, angling it to catch the driving rain. He secured the lines with knots that would hold against the devil himself. Within minutes, the canvas was channeling a steady stream of rainwater into a plastic jerry can. He came back inside, dripping wet, carrying the first gallon of fresh water. He set it on the table and ran it through the hand pump, the rhythmic swish-swish sound filling the room. He didn't stop there. He found a draft whistling through a crack in the masonry near where Leo sat. He didn't complain about the cold. He took a block of beeswax, softened it in his hands, and sealed the gap, pressing the wax into the stone until the whistling stopped. He opened a packet of rations, heating the chemical pouch until steam rose from the foil. The smell of processed beef and salt filled the small room, cutting through the damp air. Elena watched him, stunned. She had expected him to be a warrior, a creature of violence. She hadn't expected this. For Caleb, the mission parameters had shifted. It was no longer search and destroy. It was search and sustain. He poured the purified water into a tin cup and knelt in front of Leo. The boy looked at him, eyes huge in the candlelight. Caleb held, the cup out. His hand, usually trembling slightly from nerve damage, was rock steady. Leo took a sip, then another. He looked at Caleb and gave a tiny nod. In that moment, Caleb felt a surge in his chest. It was familiar, sharp, and electric, like the adrenaline before a breach. But this wasn't the rush of combat. It wasn't the hyper-focus of taking a life. It was the fierce, burning pride of sustaining one. He stood up and looked around the room. The candle flickered. The wind howled outside, powerless to reach them. He had turned a cold stone tower into a fortress. "We're fine," Caleb said, his voice low, cutting through Elena's fear. "Eat." He sat back against the wall, Gunner resting his head on his knee. For the first time in years, the ringing in his ears seemed to fade, drowned out not by the storm, but by the quiet sound of a child drinking water he had provided. The storm outside did not relent. If anything, it grew more personal. The wind hammered against the stone walls with a rhythmic, booming violence, shaking the iron bones of the gallery. For Caleb, the noise was no longer just sound. It was a physical weapon. The drop in barometric pressure combined with the howling gale turned the tinnitus in his ears into a white-hot shriek. It was a frequency that drilled directly into the center of his skull, a phantom alarm that wouldn't shut off. He stood near the window, his back to the room, gripping the sill until his knuckles turned white. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to hit the wall, fighting the nausea that rolled over him in waves. He thought he was hiding it. He thought he was invisible in his pain. But he was being watched. Leo sat on the pile of blankets near the heater. The boy hadn't spoken a word since the car crash. He hadn't cried. He simply observed the world with eyes that were too dark, too deep for a 6-year-old. He saw the way Caleb's jaw clenched. He saw the tremor in the soldier's hand as he reached for a glass of water. Leo knew that look. He knew what it felt like when the world became too loud to bear. Caleb turned and caught the boy staring. For a second, two broken generations looked at each other across the dim room. The soldier who couldn't silence the noise, and the child who couldn't make a sound. Caleb exhaled slowly. He walked over to his tactical rucksack in the corner. He dug through the gear, flares, medical kits, climbing rope, until he found what he was looking for. He knelt in front of Leo. The boy didn't flinch, though Gunnar lifted his head to watch. Caleb held up a pair of heavy, military-grade tactical headphones. They were scarred and scratched, dusted with desert sand that never quite washed off. "These block the bad noise," Caleb said, his voice low and rough. "But you can still hear the good stuff, like voices." He gently placed them over Leo's ears. The cups were too big, swallowing the boy's small face, but the seal was tight. The effect was instant. The roaring boom of the wind vanished, replaced by a dull, distant thud. The high-pitched whistling of the draft disappeared. Leo blinked. His shoulders, which had been drawn up tight toward his ears for hours, suddenly dropped. A slow, tentative smile spread across the boy's face. He reached up, touched the plastic shell, and looked at Caleb with pure, unfiltered gratitude. And then, something strange happened. As Caleb watched the tension leave the boy's body, the screaming in his own ears began to fade. The sharp spike of pain behind his eyes dulled. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, synchronized with the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Leo's chest. Many people would call this a miracle, or the softening of a hardened heart. But science has a name for it. It is called co-regulation. A nervous system trapped in trauma, like Caleb's, is stuck in a permanent state of fight or flight. It is an engine redlining in neutral, burning itself out. It cannot calm down on its own. It needs an anchor. When Caleb stepped in to soothe the child, he inadvertently created a feedback loop. By regulating Leo's fear, his own biology responded. His brain released oxytocin to counter the cortisol. Caleb didn't know the chemistry. He only knew that for the first time in 3 days the alarm bell in his head had stopped ringing. He wasn't saving the boy. The boy was saving him. In the corner, Gunnar stood up. The old Malinois limped across the stone floor, his claws clicking softly. He ignored Caleb. He ignored the door. He walked straight to Elena, who was sitting with her back against the curved wall, watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. Gunnar sniffed her hand once, then let out a long sigh and collapsed heavily onto the floor, resting his blocky head squarely on her thigh. Elena froze, then slowly, hesitantly wove her fingers into the thick fur of his neck. Gunnar closed his eyes. 3 casualties of different wars, finding a ceasefire in a stone tower. "He likes you," Caleb said, standing up and moving to the small stove to check the water. "He usually doesn't trust civilians." "I'm not a civilian," Elena whispered. Her voice was raspy, worn thin by days of shouting against the wind and years of silence. "Not anymore." Caleb looked at her. "Who are you running from, Elena? And don't tell me it's just the storm." Elena looked down at the dog. She traced the scar on Gunnar's hip. "My husband," she said. "Ex-husband. He's a powerful man, a lawyer. He knows how to twist words until they mean things you never said." She looked up, and the fire in her eyes matched the storm outside. "He didn't hit me. He didn't have to. He just erased me. He took my bank accounts. He took my friends. And then he tried to take Leo." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "Leo stopped speaking the night the police came to our house the first time. He saw his father screaming at me and he just turned off. He decided the world wasn't worth talking to anymore." She looked at her son, who was humming softly to himself, lost in the safe silence of the headphones. "The court said I was unstable," Elena continued, bitter tears sliding down her face. "Because I got angry. Because I shouted. My husband stayed calm, so he was the stable one. The judge gave him full custody. I took Leo and ran before the order was signed." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that. He knew what it was like to be judged by men who had never stood on the ground you stood on. He knew what it was like to scream the truth and have no one hear you. "You're not unstable," Caleb said. The authority in his voice was absolute. "You're reacting to a threat. That's not madness, that's survival." He walked over and sat on the floor opposite them, his back against the cold stone, forming a triangle of defense. "The storm will break tomorrow," he said quietly. "But until it does, nobody comes through that door. Not the wind, not the water, and not him." Elena looked at him, and for the first time she believed it. She closed her eyes, her hand still buried in Gunner's fur, and finally she slept. By the third night, the ocean's rage had settled into a sullen, rhythmic throb. The wind no longer screamed. It moaned, circling the lighthouse like a predator that had lost interest but wasn't ready to leave. Inside the tower, the air felt heavy. Not with dampness, but with the weight of things left unsaid. Elena stood by the small window, watching the moonlight fracture against the retreating clouds. She traced the cold condensation on the glass with one finger. "The road," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the room. "The washout should be passable by morning." Caleb didn't look up from the map he was studying, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. "Likely," he said. The word fell between them like a stone. "We should go," Elena continued, though her feet didn't move. Before he finds out where we are." Caleb nodded. It was the logical tactical decision. Extraction complete, hostages secure, release to safety. It was what he was trained to do. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harsh against the stone floor. "I need to check the gear," he muttered, and climbed the iron stairs to the lantern room before she could see his face. Up in the glass tower, the air was colder. Caleb sat on his workbench, a solitary island in the dark. He laid out his maintenance mat. He pulled his service pistol from its holster and began to strip it down. Slide, spring, barrel, pin. The smell of gun oil filled the small space, sharp, chemical, and strangely comforting. It was the perfume of his past life, a scent that meant readiness. He began to wipe the carbon from the firing pin with a slow, rhythmic motion. He didn't hear her climb the stairs. He only knew she was there when the scent of rain and wool shifted the air in the room. Elena stood at the top of the stairs, wrapped in one of his old wool blankets. She didn't speak immediately. She just watched. She watched his large, scarred hands manipulate the small, deadly components with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man of his size. "You touch it like it's glass," she said quietly. Caleb paused, a rag wrapped around his finger. "If it jams," he said, repeating the mantra drilled into him 2 decades ago, "I die." Elena stepped closer. She wasn't afraid of the weapon. She leaned against the workbench, looking at the disassembled steel. "I'm a restorer," she said, her eyes following his hands. "Paintings, old ones, Renaissance, Baroque. Sometimes they come to me in pieces. Rotted canvas, cracked varnish, holes where the history fell out." Caleb looked up at her. The moonlight caught the fatigue etched into her face, but also the steel beneath it. "People think restoration is about making things look new," Elena said. "It's not. It's about stabilizing the damage. You don't paint over the cracks. You fill them just enough so the picture holds together. You respect the trauma." She reached out, her finger hovering inches from the gun, barrel on the mat. "You're doing the same thing," she whispered. "You're not just cleaning a machine, Caleb. You're trying to keep the parts from grinding each other down." Caleb looked at the gun parts, then at his own hands. Respect the trauma. 2 people from different worlds. One who spent his life breaking things to protect others, and one who spent her life gluing broken things back together. They stood there in the cold light of the dead lantern, and for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt like a bridge. Elena reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, battered tin. "I made tea," she said, setting it on the bench next to the gun oil. "It's not much, but it's warm." She turned and went back downstairs, leaving him with the steam rising into the cold air. Caleb sat there for a long time. The pistol lay reassembled, cold and heavy. The fire in the wood stove downstairs popped loudly, a sound like a distant gunshot. It triggered something in Caleb's chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the war. He looked out at the dark horizon. He knew Noah, the hypothetical safe choice, the normal life, was out there somewhere for Elena. A life of quiet suburbs and legal battles and safety. A life without ringing ears and locked doors. A part of him, the coward hiding behind the soldier, wanted her to go. He wanted to open that door at first light and push them out. "Let them leave," the voice in his head whispered. "If they stay, you have to worry. If they stay, you have to feel. If they stay, you can lose them." He remembered the men he had lost. He remembered the phone calls he had to make to wives who sounded just like Elena. He remembered deciding, years ago, that he would never hold anything fragile again because his hands were made for crushing. It was safer to be the lighthouse keeper of a dead light. It was safer to be alone with the noise in his head. But then he looked at the cup of tea. It was a small thing, insignificant, but it was placed there by hands that knew how to fix torn canvas. Caleb realized with a jolt of terror that the safety of isolation was a lie. It wasn't peace. It was just a slow way to rot. If he let them go tomorrow, he wouldn't just be returning to his solitude. He would be returning to a grave he had dug for himself. The silence would come back, but this time, without the hope that someone might knock. He picked up the tea. It was still warm. The greatest courage of a soldier isn't charging into fire. It's standing still in the open, without armor, and admitting that you are terrified of being left behind. Caleb drank the tea. He finished cleaning his weapon, not because he expected an enemy, but because he had something worth guarding. He holstered the gun, turned off the lantern room light, and walked back down into the warmth of the tower. He wasn't ready to say the words yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to open the door for them. If they left, they would have to walk out on their own, and he would do everything in his power to give them a reason to stay. The sun rose over a broken world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and debris scattered across the cliffs like bones. The ocean was calm, deceivingly innocent, lapping against the rocks as if it hadn't tried to swallow them whole just hours before. The sound of tires on gravel broke the morning silence. It wasn't the rhythmic crunch of a neighbor's truck. It was the heavy, aggressive hum of a luxury SUV, followed by the flashing lights of a county sheriff's cruiser. Inside the tower, the air grew instantly cold. Elena stood by the window, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't need to ask who it was. The fear in her eyes said everything. "He found us," she whispered, her voice cracking. She grabbed Leo's hand so tight the boy winced. "It's his lawyer." Two men stepped out into the mud. One was a deputy, young, looking uncomfortable in the salt air. The other was older, wearing a suit that cost more than the lighthouse itself. He held a sheaf of papers like a weapon. "Elena Vance." The lawyer's voice was sharp, cutting through the wind. "We have a court order. Custody of the minor, Leo Vance, is reverted to his father immediately due to flight risk. You are to surrender the child." Elena trembled. She looked at Caleb, then at the door. The fight drained out of her. She was a mother who had run out of road. She reached for the door handle, tears already spilling, preparing to beg. Then a hand stopped her. Caleb moved her gently aside. "Stay here," he said. He opened the heavy iron door and stepped out. But it wasn't the bearded, disheveled hermit who walked onto the gallery. Caleb was wearing his service dress blue uniform. It was old, slightly tight across the broad muscles of his shoulders, but pressed with a precision that defied the chaos of the last 3 days. His boots were polished to a black mirror. His face was shaved, revealing the sharp, unyielding jawline of a chief petty officer. He didn't look like a man hiding from the world anymore. He looked like the world should be hiding from him. He walked down the steps, Gunner limping at his heel in perfect formation. Caleb stopped 3 feet from the lawyer, occupying the space with the density of a tank. "Step back," Caleb said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed by people holding automatic weapons. The lawyer sneered, stepping forward and waving the paper. "Who are you? The gardener? This is a legal matter. Interfere, and I'll have you arrested for obstruction of justice." Caleb didn't blink. He didn't look at the paper. He looked straight at the deputy. "Officer," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold, "this structure is a decommissioned federal navigation aid. Following a catastrophic weather event, specifically a Category 2 equivalent storm, this area is designated a hazard zone under Maritime Safety Regulation 33C. The lawyer paused. "What are you talking about?" Caleb ignored him. He kept his eyes on the deputy. "Until a structural integrity assessment is filed and cleared by the district commander, this property is under lockdown. No civilians, no unauthorized personnel. That includes him." He pointed a gloved finger at the lawyer without looking at him. "This is ridiculous." The lawyer sputtered, his face turning red. "I have a court order from the state. I'm taking that boy. And I have federal jurisdiction regarding public safety on maritime infrastructure," Caleb countered. He stepped forward, forcing the lawyer to take a step back. "If you cross that gravel marker, you are trespassing in a federal hazard zone. I will detain you, and I will wait for the Coast Guard to come pick you up. Given the road conditions, that might take 2 days." The deputy looked at the crumbling cliff edge, then at the imposing figure of the Navy SEAL, and finally at the lawyer. "He's right, sir," the deputy said, stepping back toward his cruiser. "If he hasn't cleared the site, we can't enter. It's a liability issue. I can't enforce a civil order if the ground isn't safe." The lawyer looked at Caleb, searching for a crack, a sign of a bluff. He found nothing but granite. "You're buying time," the lawyer spat. "I know what you're doing." "I'm securing the perimeter," Caleb said. "You have 5 seconds to clear it." The lawyer slammed his car door. "You have 48 hours, he yelled through the window. "Then I'm coming back with a structural engineer and a warrant." Caleb stood rigid, his hand resting on Gunner's head, watching the cars reverse and disappear down the muddy track. He didn't move until the taillights vanished around the bend. Only then did his shoulders drop. He turned back to the tower. Elena was standing in the doorway, clutching Leo, staring at him as if he were a stranger. 48 hours, Caleb said, unbuttoning his collar as the adrenaline faded. "That's not forever, but in my experience, a lot can happen in 2 days. 48 hours is a lifetime when you are waiting for an attack. But it is also enough time to build a defense." Caleb did not waste the time he had bought. While he patrolled the perimeter, checking the cliff edge and reinforcing the storm shutters, Elena was waging a different kind of war inside the tower. She used Caleb's satellite phone, the signal weak but steady. She didn't call her friends. She didn't call the police who had failed her. She called a legal advocacy group for domestic survivors in Portland, a number she had memorized months ago but never had the courage to dial. This time, her voice didn't shake. She spoke with the clarity of a woman who had survived a hurricane and watched a stranger stand down a corrupt lawyer. She gave them names, dates, and account numbers. By the evening of the second day, a temporary restraining order had been filed against her husband, blocking him from removing Leo from the state. The siege was broken, not by force, but by the resolve that had hardened in the stone room. On the morning of the third day, the sun broke through the cloud cover with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. The mud on the track began to dry into hard, navigatable ruts. The road to the mainland was open. By all logic, this was the moment of departure. The threat was neutralized. The weather had cleared. The mission was complete. Caleb stood in the kitchen, drinking black coffee, watching Elena fold the blankets they had used during the storm. He waited for her to ask for help carrying her bags to the car. He waited for the polite goodbye, the promise to write that would never be kept, the return to his solitary confinement. But Elena didn't pack the bags. She folded the blankets and placed them neatly on the chest, then turned to him. "The railing outside," she said, gesturing toward the gallery. "The rust is eating through the iron. If you don't seal it before the next freeze, it will snap." Caleb looked at her over the rim of his cup. "It's a big job," he said. "I know," Elena replied. "I'm good with a brush." They didn't discuss it further. They didn't talk about the future or where they would be in a month. They simply chose to be here, right now. An hour later, they were on the gallery. Caleb had found cans of marine-grade white enamel and wire brushes in the shed. The work was hard, physical, and repetitive. They scraped away the flakes of red rust, exposing the cold iron beneath, preparing it for the new coat. Leo sat nearby, wrapped in a thick sweater, watching them. He wasn't wearing the headphones today. The ocean was calm, a rhythmic hushing sound against the cliffs, and he seemed to be testing the air, listening to the world without a filter. Caleb worked in rhythm with Elena. He watched her hands, hands that had restored Renaissance portraits, now covered in paint and rust dust, moving with confident strokes. There was a peace in the labor. It wasn't the sterile, obsessive cleaning of the dead lens in the tower. This was maintenance. This was care. This was an act of faith that there would be a tomorrow worth preserving. Gunnar, feeling the change in the atmosphere, decided that he was no longer a sentry. He was a dog. He found a piece of driftwood on the gallery floor and nudged it toward Leo. The boy looked at it, then at the dog. Gunnar nudged it again, letting out a playful huff. Leo picked up the wood and tossed it. It only went 3 feet, landing with a clatter. Gunnar scrambled for it, but his bad hip betrayed him. His paws slid on the drop cloth, and the large, dignified war dog skidded sideways, limbs flailing, before crashing softly into a bucket of supplies. He shook his head, sneezed loudly, and looked up with a goofy, lopsided grin, the driftwood hanging from his mouth like a cigar. It happened then. A sound cut through the salt air. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sea. It was a giggle, followed by a laugh. A bright, bell-clear, uninhibited laugh that bubbled up from Leo's chest and spilled out into the open sky. Elena dropped her brush. She whipped around, her hands covering her mouth, eyes filling with tears. It was the first sound her son had made in 6 months. Leo was pointing at Gunnar, laughing so hard his shoulders shook. The dog, encouraged by the response, dropped the stick and gave a short, happy bark, his tail thumping a drumbeat against the iron railing. Caleb stopped scraping. He stood frozen, the wire brush hanging in his hand. He closed his eyes. He listened. For years, Caleb Vance had believed that silence was the only cure for his broken mind. He had run to the edge of the world to escape the noise of life. He had built a fortress of isolation, believing that if he could just make the world quiet enough, the ringing in his ears would stop. He was wrong. The ocean washed against the rocks. The wind sang through the cables. A dog barked, a mother wept softly in relief, and a child laughed. It was chaotic, it was loud, it was messy, and for the first time since the explosion that had shattered his world, Caleb's head was perfectly, beautifully clear. The tinnitus was gone. It had been pushed out not by silence, but by the frequency of joy. He opened his eyes. He looked at the rusted railing that was slowly turning white under their hands. He looked at the boy and the dog. He looked at Elena, who was looking at him with a question in her eyes that didn't need to be spoken. The lighthouse lamp was dead. It would never shine for ships again. But as Caleb stood there, surrounded by the noise of a family that had found him in the storm, he realized the tower was no longer dark. He walked over to Elena, picked up a clean brush, and dipped it into the thick white paint. "We missed a spot," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Right here. Sometimes we convince ourselves that we need to be whole before we can be loved. We tell ourselves that we must fix the broken windows and silence the ringing in our ears before we dare to open the door. But Caleb Vance learned that healing doesn't happen in the quiet. It happens in the beautiful, messy chaos of letting someone else in. Life will always send storms. The wind will always howl, and the waves will always crash against the foundations we try to build. But you do not have to stand on the gallery alone. Perhaps you are the soldier, guarding a fortress of solitude, believing your scars make you dangerous. Or perhaps you are the mother, driving through the rain, looking for safety in a world that feels like it's crumbling. Whoever you are, listen to this. Don't wait for the sky to clear to build your home. Don't wait for the pain to stop before you offer your hand. Find the people who are not afraid of your thunder. Find the ones who will help you hold the door when the gale is at its worst. Because the strongest lighthouses aren't made of stone and glass. They are made of the people who refuse to leave when the lights go out. If this story of the lighthouse keeper and the boy who found his laugh touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a light in their darkness today. Leave a comment below and tell us. Who is the lighthouse in your life? And if you believe in the power of second chances, hit subscribe to join our community. May you find your shelter, may you hold your ground, and may God bless you through every season of your life.